What are the most common questions you get from marketing leaders regarding your marketing plans and budgets?
So, our marketing leaders, they very often have different priorities, but their core questions about plans and budgets, I think, really share a common goal. And it's aligning efforts with overarching business objectives, and that's corporate side and the marketing side. So, whether we're planning annual or like multi-year goal planning, or if we're prioritizing within a quarter, or even sometimes we're reacting to these dynamic market changes, their unifying concern, and we all share this on our team, is like we have to ensure that every plan drives maximum impact and ROI. And I see the questions we receive like really falling into two themes, and it's like strategic clarity. Are we focusing our priorities on the right priorities to deliver results? And operational excellence, like how do we bring these plans to market efficiently, effectively, and how do we do that like in an agile way? Because teams have to sometimes pivot. How does this plan tie to our goals? Is it driving the OKRs? This is something we capture during planning, and then this is something then that teams are managing, of course, throughout the year. Impact, like, are we investing in the right countries? Is it the right mix? Is it the right channel? All of that is, of course, critical in planning time. But then once you get these market dynamic changes, or maybe you have a campaign that's just blowing it out of the water. So then it's like, oh, wait, like we have to pivot. Like, how do we do this quickly? Where are risks if we do that? And sometimes it's a good position to be in, but sometimes like, can we spend more? Here's a bucket of
Mhm.
money. Where can we go? How efficiently can we go? And that can happen during planning and also during the year. And it's just a lot of things around scaling, around risks, around goals, and like optimization. And all of that, of course, has the operational impact. Like, how do we bring all the right teams that might be involved in the right way? How do we drive all of that review and alignment process internally, then upwards through the chain, and then bringing it back to teams once things are approved, or once we have those trade-off conversations, that they can do it in a really agile way. And that, I think, happens really fairly, probably consistently throughout both streams, but there are definitely some kind of different questions that come up depending on where we are. We see that really on both the campaign planning side and budget side, even though they are, different processes, different streams, but because of that connection point, sometimes I think just on the campaign or the plan side of things, we'll also get questions like, what is this program driving? Like, if we're talking audience, if we're talking market in a different way, a little bit more like KPI goal conversations, and just generally like, when is this running? How many markets is this running? Just give us that holistic global view. And then on the budget side of things, it's really just about, trade-offs. I've probably said that like 100 times already so far. It's like a lot of that conversation, which can happen on the campaign side, but it's just so heavily budget tied, and like just ensuring we're in the right place, but like the impact of that. And then I think like when we're in that within year time where you're adjusting, like a lot more comes up then because you're doing forecasting on the budget side. So
Yeah.
how do we ensure that, we've planned the budget, it's X number. Okay, now we're a couple months into the quarter. How close are we to that number? And oh, are we overspending? Maybe that's okay. And like, if it's having this sort of impact, and like, should we do more then in that area if that's driving this goal? Or through the forecast, sometimes you might be underspending, and that's not a position you want to be in. But if we have the right processes in place and all of the transparency kind of throughout, then we can pivot quicker. So then the conversation is like, how do we support our teams better to do that through a tool throughout the quarter? And then when those opportunities or those risk situations present themselves, how can we invest, or how can we pause? What is the right thing to pause? Things like that. So, like, our planning stream, I imagine a lot of places quite robust. So we've talked about two streams, campaign planning, budget planning. We also do strategic planning. We have OKR planning. These are also all running pretty much at the same time, and that all feeds each other. So, like, whatever your strategic plans are, whatever goals you're setting within marketing, but also kind of on the corporate side, will obviously have downstream impact. So if they're is just like this centralized way to help drive all of those, just to have like a holistic planning process in one place. So then you can, anytime you do make adjustments, I think the value of dynamic real time updates is, I mean, I can't harp on what that's worth.
Yeah.
Like that's just so critical. And then, especially then when you can have all that in place, you have this beautiful planning process, everything's perfectly seamless, great. And then, but then once you're in the year, like I said, like when any sort of shift happens or any conversation happens that requires one or more teams to pivot, or if there's more money coming in, like we have to have a great understanding of that and like the questions that we already talked about, but like our investments, and then it really becomes like, how do we have like real-time updates on forecasts that we can kind of like visually see those updates so we can adjust faster, and just like trying to help really the lift for teams so then they can focus on those times when they have to pivot.
So I'm always going to be asked which one of the initiatives drive revenue, which is always really interesting for marketing operations because some projects have that direct line to revenue, but a lot of them don't. But there's still work that's necessary. So we end up having to talk through their value and what doesn't work or doesn't happen if we don't prioritize those projects, even though there's not that direct line to revenue for the business. From there, I'm going to be asked how we're going to measure success. So for marketing ops, sometimes that will be a hard number, like we want to achieve X% of something, but other times it's just going to be maybe milestones. So we want to build a certain program by a certain date or have enablement tools and videos ready to go for the team. That often bleeds into what resources we need for success. So, inevitably, that's going to include some budget conversations. Often, money is needed for a new tool, marketing agency support, or even learning and development funds because maybe it's a missing skill set we need on the team in order to push one of those projects to success. But it's also a lot more than budget. So sometimes there's internal roadblocks that need to be moved or alignment across teams because we need cross-functional support. Um, I've even also asked for mentorship of, well, I actually don't know what I'm doing. I've not done this before, so I'm going to need some heavier coaching than maybe what I've needed in previous years or previous projects. And then probably the last but not least question I get asked because my role includes managing the tech stack. I very relatable, I'd imagine to many. How can we increase the Marketo database size while not paying more? How can we keep a flat rate year to year but get more out of Adobe? So the very not fun repeating question that comes every time that contract renewals up, which is why I like multi-year contracts so I can be asked that as few times as humanly possible.
What kinds of questions do you find they're asking like near the end of a quarter or near the end of like the half of the year about, I guess about like the plans like to date or budget to date, things like that?
Yeah, well, I plan my personal work schedule actually out in quarterly sprints. So typically at the end of the quarter, we're looking at the progress that got made or maybe didn't happen, and then talking about like why that didn't happen, what roadblocks or priorities took over, and kind of having that moment to breathe and say, is that still what we want to happen in the next quarter? Or did we maybe get a little sidetracked and we need to like revisit these priorities? So that's definitely happening on a quarterly basis. And then at the H1 mark as well is when we do our performance reviews. So it kind of gives another chance to do that, but then also tying it back to whatever personal goals got set for the year and looking at if those are still on progress or not. And budgets are talked about all year long, I feel like. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think it's mainly just check-ins of if we're gonna need some more funds for anything, if we're coming up short, or often if we have extra to give to somebody else for like a different project or different priority.
How do you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, like the difference for just like some programs, it's really easy to like directly tie those to revenue, or at least it's only like a couple of steps. And then for some other things, there's a lot more steps to try to tie it to revenue, or maybe there isn't like a clear tie. What kinds of metrics do you usually use to measure success for those programs?
Yeah, it can vary from program to program, but often it will be like maybe milestones of the project of how we're pushing it forward to get it done. So, especially if it's something like trying to revisit the privacy and compliance backend build and doing spot checks to make sure it's running the way we think it's going to, or maybe we've been alerted by legal to new policies we have to follow and incorporating that in. So typically we'll build ourselves kind of key milestones of that project, and kind of use that to be like the metric of success and stuff like that. I mean, in a way, you could say that ties to revenue because you're preventing lawsuits, but that's not what they mean when they say
Yes,
tie to revenue, right? So that's kind of
totally.
outlining milestones instead. That's kind of our workaround for still giving it some sort of like concrete definition for did we do this successfully or not.
So I can talk about two categories for this question. The first one is the different dimensions against which we break our budgets and sort of assign tags to our execution data. And the other one is the trickier one, which is the efficiency of the individual activities. So what we refer to as return on investment. So let me start with the first category, the dimensions. So normally marketing leaders are asking for, um, very different ways of cutting and breaking our budgets and planning data set. The first one is functional alignment. That's always very important. It's always a starting point. So what are our different teams planning and how are they allocating their budgets? There's always a certain effort to do zero-based budgeting, but it's always easier said than done in large companies. So the historic spending always becomes plays a big role and becomes like kind of like the really starting point. What was the baseline for a given functional area? How did that look like in the last 3 years? But from experience, I can say that the departmental structure is always where we get the first question from the leadership, both for business planning and budgeting. I've had the chance to work in and learn about two different B2B software companies who operate on a global level with strong presence in many countries in all the continents. So the departmental structure is always really dependent on the company. There's always a history when you ask people who've been there for a while. It starts with, well, many years ago, we used to look like X, Y, and Z. And so when we look at the departmental breakdown, what becomes even more important is the efficiencies that we observe when various teams sort of like work with each other instead of working in silos. So that effort to break the silos is what really leads to every year the planning season being full of like cross-functional meetings and ensuring plans reflect the efficiency that we're trying to observe. When we look at our structuring, it's the sort of like the type of marketing activity through which we get leads, such as events versus paid media. And what I've experienced is it doesn't always align to the departmental structure. So for instance, one company might 100% centralize the media spend to a single team, while another could keep it decentralized between like the geographies versus the headquarter team, because you're definitely going to be getting a question around what is our events plan. And if you don't have your events truly centralized throughout the whole organization, where maybe like a geography might have a little bit of budget and they might plan to execute a really regional sales supported event, then you're always going to miss out the total picture. So, and that's probably going to lead to allocating budget on less efficient areas and missing out on the opportunity cost. The reason why I wanted to talk about the dimensions from an efficiency perspective first is because we're generally talking about top-down budget allocation, and that's always easier than trying to really look at the individual things that every single team on the global basis is executing and trying to understand, okay, like, is this really worth the effort? Because, there are big scale things, but then there's also smaller things that add up to a big number, but the decisions are way more agile. So the campaign alignment is really important, at least in companies I had the opportunity to work at. Marketing campaigns are usually a portfolio of products, which both represent the multi-product nature of the software industry and enables opportunities of cross-sell. So when it comes to marketing campaigns, and at least companies like mine, we always talk in terms of an area our existing or potential customers need improvement within their tech stack or infrastructure, and provide a portfolio of products that would work together to solve that issue. And internally, that's what sort of translates to a marketing campaign, portfolio products as we might think about it, and more specifically programs under those campaigns. Really important area to track. We try to allocate top-down budget based on the campaign structure too. But then, that's where you're thinking about, okay, like how many different dimensions do we look at our overall cut of the pool of budget we have, and try to understand if the plans are created in the most efficient way possible. And that's where when they're entering their bottom-up plans, when the teams like individual marketers are entering their bottom-up plans, which is kind of at the individual like activity, tactic, whatever that company refers to it, we have to ensure each marketing activity is aligned to the campaigns to be able to report it back to the leadership as to how teams are utilizing their budget to support marketing strategic approach.
Do you find that trying to do zero-based budgeting as the marketing organization kind of helps with that, getting out of that like lose it and use it mentality?
But we need to stay on track, and we need to understand our priorities and our focus. That's why I think like the extent of zero-based budgeting that I have experienced, at least, it never really started with, we absolutely, X team, you start with zero budget, show us your plan, and we're going to grant budget accordingly, because it's crazy amount, like literally thousands of activities happening across the globe. But that clarification around the priority, and that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit too, products, like you touched on, companies who may be structured more by products. I definitely haven't had the experience of working in a company as such, but products are always important, because we are getting the question. Even our marketing leadership is getting the question from their business leadership, from the rest of the business, saying, hey, like for my product, how are you supporting? What is the marketing support? And when the campaign is a portfolio of products, it's really hard to, whatever accurate way you try to tag that and create the data set that way. There's always a lot of assumptions that go into the picture, but the product piece is definitely another dimension that we get a lot of questions around.
With questions coming in about plans and budgets, you also must get lots of questions then about ROI of programs going into the new year.
It's never easy to answer these questions, but you can really like do your work and dig in the data sets on the finance side and sort of like the Allocadia side, and then go back to the CRM systems and see your performance reporting. But where it comes really, really difficult is trying to compare a marketing activity that's kind of like maybe like the bottom of the funnel, right? Like trying to convert leads into, or like contacts into leads. When you try to compare that type of an activity to another one that may be trying to create awareness, how do you make that decision? The questions are more about what are we doing today with our systems, with our tools, with our processes? Do we have integration between the like gazillion tools that we have that enable to answer that question? So that's sort of more of the question, like, are we getting there to answer it?